understand this. For an avoidant, vulnerability is not just uncomfortable, it feels unsafe. It challenges the very system they built to survive emotionally. Most avoidants didn't wake up one day and decide to be distant. They learned, often very early, that closeness comes with risk rejection, disappointment, loss of control. So they adapted. They became self-contained, independent, guarded. Not because they don't feel, but because they feel deeply and don't trust what happens when those feelings take over. So when you're dealing with someone like this, you have to read a completely different language. You can't measure their love by constant affection, by big emotional speeches, or by how often they say, "I miss you." That's not their operating system. Their proof looks quieter, subtler, but far more significant when you understand what it costs them. Because here's the truth most people miss. When an avoidance shows you even a glimpse of their inner world, that is not casual. That is not accidental. That is a moment where they are overriding years, sometimes decades of conditioning. It might not look dramatic. It might come out awkwardly, indirectly, even defensively. Maybe they share a painful memory and then quickly change the subject. Maybe they admit something vulnerable and immediately downplay it with humor or distance. But don't mistake the packaging for the message. The message is, I'm letting you see something I don't let people see. And that matters. Because for them, vulnerability feels like exposure without armor. It's standing emotionally unprotected in a space where they've learned it's not safe to do so. So when they take that step, even briefly, they are choosing you over their instinct to protect themselves. That's not weakness. That's courage at a level most people don't recognize. Now, here's where you need to be sharp. Don't expect consistency right away. An avoidant might open up one day and seem distant the next. That's not hypocrisy, it's internal conflict. One part of them is moving toward connection, while another part is pulling them back to safety. And if you misinterpret that push-pull as lack of interest, you'll miss what's actually happening beneath the surface. Real connection with an avoidant is built in these moments, small openings, brief honesty, flashes of authenticity. That's where the truth lives. Not in perfection, but in willingness. Not in frequency, but in depth. And if you're paying attention, you'll notice something else. They don't open up like that with everyone. In fact, they rarely do it at all. So if they're choosing to do it with you, even imperfectly, even inconsistently, it means you've crossed a boundary most people never reach. That's why this matters so much. Because anyone can give you attention. Anyone can give you words. But not everyone can give you access to who they really are, especially someone who has spent their entire life hiding it. So don't just look for loud expressions of love. Look for the quiet moments where their guard drops, even for a second. That's where the truth is. Because when someone who is built to hide chooses, even briefly, to be seen, that's not just vulnerability. That's love, fighting through fear. Now, once you understand that vulnerability for an avoidant is already a major step, the next thing you have to recognize is how they respond when emotions start to intensify. Because this is where most people misread the situation and walk away from something real, thinking it was never there to begin with. See, when emotional closeness deepens, it activates an avoidance core fear. The fear of losing themselves, the fear of being overwhelmed, the fear of needing someone too much. And when that switch flips, their instinct is not to lean, it's to create distance. Not because the connection is weak, but because it's becoming too significant for them to comfortably manage. Now here's the distinction that matters. An avoidant who doesn't genuinely care will disappear cleanly. No confusion, no mixed signals, no emotional residue. They detach, they move on, and they don't look back. It's efficient. It's controlled. It's exactly how they've trained themselves to operate when something doesn't hold real emotional weight. But when an avoidant does feel something real, something deeper than they expected or wanted, the pattern changes. They may still pull back, but they don't fully exit your world. There's a thread that remains. Communication might slow down, become inconsistent, even frustrating at times, but it doesn't vanish entirely. They check in. They respond, even if delayed. They stay just close enough to maintain the connection, even while trying to regulate the intensity of it. And that behavior is not random, it's psychological negotiation. One part of them is trying to protect their independence, while another part is unwilling to lose the bond they've formed with you. So what you're witnessing is not disinterest, it's conflict. Internal, ongoing, unresolved conflict. This is why people get confused, because they're looking for clarity in behavior that is, by nature, conflicted. They expect consistency from someone who is literally torn between two opposing drives, connection and self-protection. Now, this doesn't mean you accept crumbs or tolerate emotional unavailability without boundaries. That's not the point. The point is understanding the signal correctly. If someone consistently disappears, cuts you off, and shows no effort to maintain any form of connection, then they are not a good partner. You're not dealing with love, you're dealing with avoidance without attachment. But if they step back and yet still remain, if they create space but never sever the bond, if they go quiet but eventually re-engage, then something else is happening. There's an emotional investment there that they don't fully know how to handle, but also cannot fully let go of. Think about that for a moment. For someone who values independence above almost everything, staying even partially connected during emotional overwhelm is not their default, it's their exception. And people don't make exceptions for things that don't matter. So instead of asking, why are they pulling away? A better question is, why are they still here at all? Because that answer will tell you far more about the depth of their feelings than their temporary distance ever could. The reality is, love doesn't always show up as constant presence. Sometimes, especially with avoidance, it shows up as resistance to leaving, a quiet refusal to completely disconnect, even when every instinct is telling them to run. And when you see that when someone is overwhelmed, conflicted, even inconsistent, yet still chooses not to disappear completely, you're not looking at indifference. You're looking at attachment that's strong enough to survive their fear. Once you begin to understand that an avoidance connection is expressed through restraint rather than intensity, you start to notice something even more telling: how they try. Not perfectly, not consistently, and definitely not in the way most people expect, but they try in ways that go directly against their own wiring. And this is where a lot of people get it wrong. They measure effort through a traditional lens: frequent communication, grand gestures, emotional reassurance on demand. But an avoidant isn't built to perform love that way, especially not at the beginning or even in the middle stages of a real connection. So if you use that metric alone, you'll overlook the very behaviors that actually signal something deeper. Because for an avoidant, effort is not about intensity, it's about override. It's about doing something that feels unnatural, uncomfortable, even slightly threatening to their sense of control, simply because the connection matters enough to justify it. That might look like them checking in when they would normally stay silent. It might be them agreeing to spend more time together when their instinct is to preserve distance. It could be as subtle as them remembering something important to you and acting on it, even if they never make a big deal out of it. These aren't dramatic acts, but psychologically, they're significant. Why? Because every one of those moments represents a decision to lean slightly toward connection instead of retreat, a decision to consider someone else's emotional world, even when their default is to prioritize their own space and autonomy. Now, will it be consistent? Not always. Will it sometimes feel confusing? Absolutely. But inconsistency doesn't automatically mean lack of care. In this context, it often reflects the internal push and pull we talked about earlier, the tension between wanting closeness and fearing what that closeness demands. What matters is the pattern beneath the inconsistency. Are they, over time, making small adjustments? Are they stretching beyond their comfort zone, even if only by a few inches at a time? Are they showing in quiet ways that your needs register in their awareness? Because here's the deeper truth. An avoidant who doesn't care won't stretch at all. They'll stay rigid, predictable in their distance, unmoved by your presence or absence. There's no effort there, just maintenance of their own emotional equilibrium. But when they do care, something shifts. Not dramatically, not overnight, but subtly and meaningfully. They begin to negotiate with themselves. I don't usually do this, but I will. And that internal negotiation is where their version of love starts to take shape. You have to understand, for someone who has built their identity around self-reliance, even small acts of consideration can feel like a loss of control. So when they choose to do those things anyway, they are prioritizing the connection over their instinct for emotional safety. That's not casual. That's intentional. And if you're paying attention, you'll see that their effort often shows up in actions more than words. They may not articulate their feelings clearly, but they demonstrate presence in moments that matter. They show up when it counts, even if they disappear at times when things feel too heavy. So the question is not, are they doing enough compared to someone else? The real question is, are they doing more than their old self would have done? Because that's where growth lies. That's where sincerity reveals itself. Anyone can perform love when it's easy. But when someone starts to move against their own patterns, when they begin to bend, even slightly, in the direction of connection that's not performance, that's effort rooted in something real. As you start to see their effort in small, meaningful ways, there's another shift that carries even more weight, one that's easy to overlook if you're only focused on words or intensity. It's the moment they begin to let you into their world, not just emotionally in brief flashes, but practically structurally in the way they live their life. Because for an avoidant, their life is carefully organized around one core principle: control over their time, their space, and their energy. That control is what gives them a sense of safety. It's how they regulate stress, avoid overwhelm, and maintain a stable sense of self. So they don't just hand that access over lightly. When they start including you in their routine, when you're no longer an occasional interaction, but a presence within their daily or weekly rhythm that's not random. That's a shift in priority. That's them making space where historically there was none. Now, this won't necessarily look like dramatic declarations of commitment. In fact, if you're waiting for that, you might miss what's actually happening. For an avoidant, integration often replaces verbal affirmation. They might not say, "You mean everything to me," but they start showing you that you matter through access. You'll notice it in subtle ways. You're part of their plans, not just an afterthought. They begin to share parts of their routine, how they spend their time, what they do when they're alone, the environments where they feel most like themselves. They invite you into spaces that were once private, whether that's their home, their schedule, or even their mental bandwidth. And this is significant because those spaces are not just physical, they're psychological. An avoidance routine is a boundary. It's a structure designed to keep emotional demands at a manageable level. So when they start adjusting that structure to include you, they are, in a very real sense, reconfiguring their comfort zone. Think about that. Someone who has spent years, sometimes a lifetime, reinforcing independence is now allowing another person to exist within that independence. Not replacing it, not surrendering it, but expanding it to make room for you. That's their version of commitment. It's not about losing themselves in the relationship. It's about letting the relationship coexist with who they are. And that's a much more sustainable, authentic form of connection than forced closeness or performative intensity. Now, again, this doesn't mean perfection. There may still be moments where they retreat, where they need space, where they reassert their boundaries. That's part of their nature. But the difference is you're no longer kept entirely outside of their world. You're part of it, even if the access comes in layers. And here's what you need to understand. Avoidants don't integrate people they don't value. If the connection is superficial, they keep it compartmentalized. It stays separate from their core life, easy to access, easy to exit. But when it's real, that separation starts to dissolve. Slowly, deliberately, but unmistakably. You move from being an option to being a presence. So instead of asking, why aren't they expressing more? Look at where you exist in their life. Are you being woven into their time, their habits, their space? Because that tells you something far more concrete than words ever could. Anyone can say they care, but not everyone will restructure their life, even slightly, to reflect it. And when someone who guards their independence, that fiercely starts making room for you within it, they're not just spending time with you. They're building a place for you where no one else easily gets to be. By now, you can see the pattern. Nothing about an avoidance behavior is loud or obvious. It's layered, restrained, often misunderstood. And that brings us to one of the most misinterpreted signals of all, the fact that they come back. Because let's be honest, when someone pulls away, the natural reaction is to assume disinterest. You feel the distance, the silence, the shift in energy, and your mind fills in the blanks. If they cared, they wouldn't leave. And in many situations, that's a fair conclusion. But with an avoidant, that interpretation can be incomplete. You have to separate two very different behaviors: withdrawing and detaching. Withdrawing is a temporary response to emotional overwhelm. Detaching is a permanent decision to disconnect. They may look similar on the surface, but psychologically, they come from entirely different places. An avoidant who is not emotionally invested detaches cleanly. There's no return, no revisiting, no emotional residue. They close the door and move forward because there's nothing internally pulling them back. But when they are invested, when the connection has reached a level that impacts them more deeply than they're comfortable with, they often withdraw instead. They step back to regulate, to regain a sense of control, to quiet the internal tension that closeness creates. And during that time, it can feel like they've disappeared, but then they return. Maybe it's a message out of nowhere. Maybe it's a casual check-in that seems almost too neutral for what you shared. Maybe they re-engage as if no time has passed, avoiding direct acknowledgement of the distance. However it shows up, the pattern is the same. They re-enter your world after stepping out of it. And that return matters because people don't come back to what they feel nothing for, especially not avoidants who are highly efficient at cutting emotional ties when those ties don't serve them. Coming back requires them to reopen a connection they deliberately stepped away from. It requires them to face, again, the very emotions that caused them to retreat in the first place. So why did they do it? Because the connection didn't leave them. Even in distance, it stayed active somewhere beneath the surface. And over time, that internal pull becomes stronger than their need to avoid it completely. Now, this doesn't mean every return is healthy or that it should be accepted without boundaries. That's where discernment comes in. A pattern of leaving and returning without growth can become a cycle that drains you. But the presence of return itself, especially when paired with the other signs we've talked about, reveals something important. They're not done with you. And more importantly, they can't fully be done with you. Because if they could, they would. Avoidants don't linger where they feel nothing. They don't revisit connections that are easy to replace. They move on quietly, efficiently, without looking back. So when someone keeps finding their way back into your life, despite their own instinct to withdraw, you have to ask yourself a different question. Not why did they leave, but what keeps bringing them back? Because the answer to that question points directly to emotional attachment. Not always expressed clearly, not always handled well, but real nonetheless. And when someone repeatedly returns to a connection that challenges their comfort, their control, and their sense of safety, you're not looking at indifference. You're looking at a bond that refuses to break, even when they try to walk away. And when you've seen all of this, the vulnerability, the distance without disappearance, the effort, the integration, the returning dash, there's one final layer that ties it all together. It's quieter than the rest, less visible on the surface, but in many ways, it's the most revealing of all. They don't replace you easily. Now, this is where you have to look beyond appearances, because an avoidant can seem like they've moved on quickly. They can distract themselves, redirect their focus, even connect with other people on a surface level. And if you're only watching behavior from the outside, you might conclude that was easy for them. It didn't mean much, but internally, it's not that simple. Avoidants are experts at emotional suppression, not emotional erasure. They don't always process feelings in real time. They compartmentalize them. They push them aside to maintain control. So what looks like moving on is often just postponing. The emotional imprint of a meaningful connection doesn't disappear, it gets stored, deferred, held beneath the surface where it doesn't interfere with their immediate sense of stability. And this is why genuine love leaves a mark on them in a way they can't easily override. When an avoidant truly connects with someone, that person becomes associated with a rare experience, emotional access without total loss of self. That's not something they encounter often. So even if they step away, even if they try to return to their default patterns, there's a reference point now that didn't exist before. They compare, consciously or unconsciously. New interactions feel different, often shallower, less significant, harder to invest in. Not because other people lack value, but because the internal standard has changed. They've experienced something that challenged their defenses in a meaningful way, and that experience doesn't just reset. You might see this in subtle behaviors. They linger in your orbit, even indirectly. They check your presence without fully re-engaging. They struggle to build the same depth elsewhere, or they cycle through connections that never quite reach the same level. And sometimes they come back not just once, but repeatedly because what they felt with you remains unresolved. Now again, this isn't about romanticizing inconsistency or waiting indefinitely. It's about understanding the signal. Someone who can easily replace you was never deeply attached to begin with. For an avoidant, detachment without residue is simple when the connection is shallow. But when it's real, detachment becomes complicated because they're not just leaving a person there, leaving an experience of themselves that only existed within that connection. And that's much harder to let go of. So even if they don't articulate it, even if they never fully explain it, their patterns reveal it. The hesitation to move on completely, the difficulty in forming something equally meaningful, the quiet returns, the emotional echoes that don't quite fade. That's the imprint of genuine connection. And if you step back and look at the full picture, it tells a very different story than the one most people assume. It's not a lack of feeling, it's a difficulty in managing the depth of it. It's not indifference, it's internal conflict. It's not replacement, it's resistance to losing something that mattered more than they expected. Because at the end of the day, people don't struggle to replace what was never significant. They struggle to replace what changed them. When you step back and look at everything we've explored, a very different picture begins to form, one that challenges the way most people define love. Because if you're expecting love to always be obvious, consistent, and easy to read, you will completely miss it when it comes from someone who is wired to protect themselves from it. An avoidant doesn't prove love through intensity. They prove it through contradiction. They open up when every instinct tells them to stay closed. They stay even when they feel the urge to run. They try even when effort feels unnatural. They make space for you in a life built on independence. They return even after pulling away. And they struggle to replace you even when they attempt to move on. That's not confusion, that's internal resistance meeting genuine emotion. Now let's be clear about something. Understanding this does not mean you abandon your standards. It doesn't mean you accept inconsistency without boundaries or ignore your own emotional needs. Love, no matter the form, still requires growth, accountability, and mutual effort to survive in a healthy way. But what it does mean is this: you stop mislabeling depth as indifference. You stop expecting someone to love you in a language they were never taught, and instead you learn to recognize the one they're struggling to speak. Because real love isn't always loud. It isn't always smooth, and it isn't always comfortable. Sometimes real love looks like someone fighting themselves just to stay connected to you. And when you see that clearly, without illusion, without over-romanticizing, but also without dismissing it, you gain something powerful: discernment. The ability to know the difference between someone who can't love you well yet and someone who simply doesn't love you at all. And that distinction changes everything, because the deepest truth is this: love is not proven by how perfectly someone shows up. It's proven by how much of themselves they're willing to confront just to not lose you.